I never thought I'd be telling this story. I'm Rebecca Hayes, 31, a freelance graphic designer working from my home office in the picture-perfect Elmwood Acres, HOA, just outside Chicago. I used to believe in the American dream of friendly neighbors and community spirit the way kids believe in backyard barbecues and block parties until I learned that in an HOA community doesn't mean loyalty, especially not when Karen is in charge. They laughed at me right there in front of the entire neighborhood at the memorial service. And when the lawyer cleared his throat and opened the envelope, I just stared at their smug faces because I already knew what was inside. I helped draft it after all. Harold Grant was everything to me in this neighborhood. After his wife passed from cancer in 2008, the dynamics in Elmwood Acres shifted dramatically. Karen Beaumont, now 46, became the self-appointed golden child of the board married to a real estate developer who knew how to schmooze. With their McMansion on the corner lot and two Instagram-perfect kids who never played outside because the grass might get disturbed, she ruled with an iron fist wrapped in pastel cardigans. Derek Mills, 28, was the charming but aimless board treasurer who could talk his way out of any violation notice. And then there was Lisa Harrington, the social media influencer type, who posted about community values while never lifting a finger. Me? I was the black sheep, single career focused, and apparently not living up to the HOA standard of perfection. At least that's what Karen wanted everyone to believe. The truth was far more complicated. Harold and I had a quiet but deep bond that grew in private. While Karen paraded him around at HOA meetings for photo ops, and Derek showed up to borrow from the community fund for his projects, I was the one who took Harold to his chemo appointments in my old SUV. I was the one who researched experimental treatments online late into the night. I was the one who held his hand when the pain meds weren't cutting it and the neighborhood gossip was too loud. But publicly, Harold coddled them. He praised Karen's dedication to standards and overlooked Derek's repeated accounting errors that somehow benefited his side hustle. Meanwhile, my contributions, like organizing the free neighborhood watch during the big storm or helping elderly residents with their yard work to avoid fines, were met with polite nods and quick subject changes. "You've always been so independent, Rebecca," Harold would say with a slight wink. I come to understand it meant you don't need the fake cheerleading. I accepted this dynamic because I knew what was real, or at least I thought I did. The pattern had been established long ago. Karen and her allies weren't just indifferent, they were parasites on the HOA treasury. On March 5th, 2019, I discovered a $1,800 charge on my credit card from the local landscaping company. When I confronted Karen at the monthly meeting, she batted her fake lashes and said, "Oh, Harold didn't tell you. He said to use your card for the community flower beds, and he'd reimburse you." I guess he forgot. Harold was in the hospital that week. He couldn't have told her anything. In July 2020, Derek borrowed my lawnmower for a board project. He crashed it while testing it after a few beers, then called an emergency meeting where everyone insisted I shouldn't file an insurance claim. It would ruin the community harmony, Karen argued while Derek nodded solemnly. Harold stayed quiet. I paid the $2,500 repair myself. The HOA potluck in Thanksgiving 2022 was particularly brutal. I had just ended a 2-year relationship with my boyfriend, who'd chosen a job in the city over our future. As I placed the homemade pie I'd brought on the table, Karen smirked. "You brought pie instead of a +1 again? Huh?" The table erupted in laughter, including Harold, who later apologized, privately saying, "You know how she is. Just let it roll off your back." By December 2023, Harold's cancer had returned with a vengeance. The doctor recommended specialized home care equipment. When the $3,200 bill arrived, I paid it without question. Later that night, Karen texted, "You do the money stuff better anyway, LOL. Thanks." Derek didn't even acknowledge it. I kept thinking about the old community photos on Harold's wall. In each one, Karen stood front and center. Derek goofed off to the side. Harold smiled proudly, and I, if present at all, stood slightly apart watching. It was a visual representation of our neighborhood dynamic. Them and then me. As Harold's health deteriorated, so did any pretense of community unity. Karen visited once a week for exactly 45 minutes, usually with her kids in tow, creating chaos, then complained about having to drive from her end of the subdivision, as if it were across the country. Derek occasionally FaceTimed from whatever business trip his latest scheme was based in. Meanwhile, I practically moved into Harold's guest room to help with daily needs. The night Harold told me he was stopping treatment, we sat together on his screened porch watching fireflies rise from the lawn. "You know I see everything, right, Rebecca?" he said, his voice thin but clear. "I've always seen." I nodded, unsure what he meant exactly. "I made mistakes with all of you," he continued. "But the biggest was letting them believe fines and rules could replace real care." He squeezed my hand. "We need to talk to Eli." Eli Sampson was Harold's attorney and oldest friend. The meeting happened 2 weeks before Harold died. While Karen was at a charity HOA gala and Derek was supposedly pitching investors, I drove Harold to the law offices downtown. What happened in that wood-paneled conference room would change everything. By the time we left, the Elmwood Legacy Trust had been formed, with me owning 51% voting rights in all major decisions. The trust quietly took possession of the community fund worth about $1.4 million, the rights to the HOA parkland, and even the royalties from Harold's self-published book on neighborhood history, which ironically had been optioned by a local podcast after years of rejection. "They'll fight you," Harold warned as we drove home. "Be ready." "Why now?" I asked. "Why not years ago?" He looked out the window, the Chicago suburbs reflecting in his glasses. "Because I was a coward. Because I thought I could fix them. Because I didn't want to admit I'd failed as the founder." He turned to me. "And because I needed to be sure you were strong enough to handle what comes next." I wasn't sure I was, but I nodded anyway. The revised bylaws were drafted, notarized, and witnessed by Lillian Dent, Harold's former assistant, and Judge Miriam K., an old friend. I would inherit 85% control of all remaining governance. Karen and Derek would each receive a token $5,000 from the fund, enough to avoid complete contestation. Eli explained the details carefully. Harold died peacefully in his sleep on March 10th, 2024. I was asleep in the chair beside his bed, my hand on his. I woke to stillness. The memorial was set for March 25th at the Elmwood Community Center. Karen's choice, naturally. I would have preferred the park where Harold used to host fishing tournaments, but I was outvoted. Karen took control of all arrangements, sending me patronizing texts. "Don't worry about the flowers. I know which ones Harold liked. I got the photo slideshow covered. Derek knows someone who does amazing video work. Lisa is writing the most beautiful eulogy. You just focus on yourself right now." I stayed quiet. Let them have their show. The morning of the memorial arrived with appropriate gloom, a light March drizzle that misted the lawns and fogged the community center windows. I arrived early to have a moment alone with Harold's memory, but Karen was already there directing the staff about chair arrangements like a general on a battlefield. She barely acknowledged me. "Oh, good. You're here," she said, not looking up from her clipboard. "The second row on the left is for the rest of us. Front row is for me, my husband, the kids, and Derek when he gets here." You understand, right? I didn't, but I took my seat in the second row, feeling the weight of every ridiculous fine she'd ever slapped on my mailbox for being one shade too blue. As guests filtered in, I recognized faces from a monthly meetings, the golf club, and a few distant homeowners. Lillian Dent caught my eye and gave me a knowing nod before sitting near the front. The service began with Derek running in 10 minutes late, phone in hand, sliding into the front row, clapping Karen's husband on the shoulder as if they were at a sports bar. Then came the eulogies. Karen went first, dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Our founder," she began, emphasizing the word while looking directly at me, "valued community standards above all else." She spent 15 minutes describing a Harold I barely recognized, one who apparently spent weekends measuring grass heights and attending her perfectly staged HOA luncheons. She mentioned me once. Rebecca always meant, well, even if she wasn't around much for the real work. The crowd chuckled softly, my hand clenched in my lap. Derek's eulogy was brief, but no less fiction. He told a story about Harold teaching him to enforce the rules properly, something that never happened. As his late wife had handled most of that before she died, he showed the crowd his first violation notice claiming Harold had kept it in his desk. I knew for a fact Harold carried only one personal item in his wallet, a faded photo of his wife. Then came the memory montage set to Harold's favorite Sinatra song. It displayed hundreds of neighborhood photos. Karen's victory, garden party, Derek's college graduation party, family holidays. I appeared in perhaps 3 images, always at the edge, always looking slightly out of place. There is not a single photo of me with Harold alone, though dozens existed from our quiet afternoons researching treatments or just sitting on his porch. I sat frozen. Rage wasn't the word. This wasn't grief. It was theft. Theft of legacy, of care, of truth. After the service, Karen's husband smirked as he passed me. Derek snapped a selfie by the floral display, captioning it, saying goodbye to the legend for his Instagram. Karen informed me that the post-memorial reception would be at the community hall at 6 p.m. Then added, if you're too tired, everyone would understand. I excused myself and drove straight to Eli Sampson's office. Eli was waiting. It's time, he said simply. I nodded. Let's make sure everyone's there. While Eli prepared, I changed into the navy dress I brought with me. Structured professional armor. We arrived at the community hall at 6:45 p.m. Purposefully late walking in, I held a manila envelope close to my side. The room fell silent as we entered. Karen stood near the punch bowl, champagne in hand, looking annoyed at the interruption. Derek was charming a young homeowner in the corner. A few of Harold's old golf buddies nodded respectfully in my direction. Eli cleared his throat. At the request of Mr. Harold Grant, I will now read the contents of his final bylaws amendment. Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. We already know what it says, Eli. Can this wait for a more appropriate time? I'm afraid, Mr. Grant was very specific about the timing. Eli replied, removing his reading glasses from his breast pocket. The room stilled. Eli began to read. I, Harold William Grant, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare this to be my last amendment to the Elmwood Acres HOA Bylaws, revoking all previous versions. He continued through the legal preamble while Karen tapped her foot impatiently. Derek had stopped his flirtation and wandered closer, curiosity piqued. To Rebecca Hayes, who held my hand when the world stopped making sense, who showed me the meaning of real community care, when others showed me only obligation, I leave 85% voting control of all remaining HOA governance, including, but not limited to, the community fund, all parkland, and all decision-making authority not already transferred to the Elmwood Legacy Trust. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Karen's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. Eli continued, to Karen Beaumont and Derek Mills, I leave the sum of $5,000 each along with this message. I hope these gifts remind you of the value of presence, not performance. Karen's shriek cut through the murmurs. This is fraud. She stormed toward Eli, finger pointed accusingly. She manipulated him when he was sick. This isn't what he wanted. Derek tried to laugh it off, muttering, yeah, right. Nice stunt, Rebecca. Eli remained calm. I have here the notarized original signed by your founder on February 18th, 2024, witnessed by Lillian Dent and Judge Miriam K., both of whom have provided sworn affidavits confirming Mr. Grant's mental competence at the time of signing. Karen turned to her husband. Do something. Call Dennis. Dennis was her husband's attorney friend. Her husband shifted uncomfortably. Karen, if Judge K witnessed it, I don't think Dennis would touch this. It's too legitimate. What the hell is the Elmwood Legacy Trust? Derek demanded, his face flushed. That's when I stepped forward, opening my manila envelope. A trust formed on February 15th, 2024, holding assets valued at approximately $2.3 million. Harold and I established it together. I placed the documents on the table. I own 51% voting rights. The next few minutes were chaos. Karen screamed accusations about undue influence. Derek alternated between threats and attempts to negotiate. Their performative grief was gone, replaced by naked greed for control. I noticed a few guests holding up phones recording the meltdown. A distant homeowner's teen was live streaming to TikTok. By morning, Elmwood Acres Memorial Meltdown would have 2.1 million views. In the midst of the storm, I found myself oddly calm. I caught Lillian's eye across the room. She gave me a small nod. This was what Harold had prepared me for. Karen's final play was to turn to the assembled guests, tears suddenly streaming down her camera-ready face. My neighbor manipulated our dying founder. She isolated him from the Real board. This isn't what Harold wanted. That's when I pulled out the final document, a USB drive containing a video recorded the day after the bylaws signing. I handed it to the event manager, who connected it to the room's presentation system. Harold appeared on screen, thin but clear-eyed, sitting in his favorite leather chair. If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and my neighbors are probably arguing about power. His dry chuckle was so familiar it made my heart ache. I want to state for the record that I am of sound mind. The decisions I've made regarding the HOA reflect my wishes and my values. He leaned forward slightly. Karen, Derek, I like you both, but like doesn't mean blindness. For years, I watched you take advantage of Rebecca's good nature. I watched you dismiss her help while expecting her to clean up your messes with the fund. I failed all of you by allowing this pattern. He sat back. Rebecca has been the only one who showed up consistently without expectation of reward. The only one who cared for the community, not what it could provide. My final gift to all of you is this truth. Karen and Derek, I hope you learn from it. Rebecca, I hope you find peace in it. The video ended. The room was silent. Derek's date whispered something in his ear, then grabbed her purse and left. Karen's husband stood several feet away from her, suddenly fascinated by his phone. Our quiet neighbor Aunt Rachel walked over and put her arm around my shoulders. I spoke into the silence, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Harold didn't just give me the control. He gave me the truth you try to bury. Now it's yours to choke on. I walked out, Eli beside me, Aunt Rachel following. Behind us, I heard Karen's wail of rage and Derek's attempt to salvage the situation. There must be a loophole, right? But there wasn't. The aftermath was both exactly what I'd expected and nothing like I'd imagined. Karen filed a lawsuit claiming undue influence within days. Her case collapsed when Judge K testified about Harold's mental clarity and determination. The video testimony was entered into evidence along with financial records showing years of one-sided giving on my part from the community fund that Karen and Derek had quietly siphoned for their board events while finding the rest of us for grass 2/10 of an inch too tall. Derek tried a different approach. He showed up at my townhouse one rainy April evening, soaking wet and supposedly contrite. I messed up Rebecca. I see that now, he said, perched uncomfortably on my sofa. But we're still neighbors. We should stick together. Funny how neighborhood becomes important when power's involved, I replied. It's not about the power, he insisted. Well, not just about the power. My business partners are nervous about the negative press. That TikTok video has them questioning my judgment. So this is about saving your latest doomed venture. He flinched. Don't be like that. Look, I'm asking for a second chance. We can rebuild. Maybe you could vote to keep some of the old rules. It would show good faith to the board. I actually laughed. Get out, Derek. You've changed, he said accusingly at the door. No, I corrected him. I've just stopped pretending. Karen's approach was more public. She gave an interview to the local suburban paper, painting herself as the devoted president and me as the manipulative outsider. Unfortunately for her, the journalist did some digging and discovered meeting minutes showing who had actually been present during Harold's illness and who had been using the fund for private landscaping. The piece became an expose on HOA power disputes and featured statement from residents about who they remembered being consistently at Harold's side, mowing lawns for free or researching grants instead of finding them. By summer, the legal battles were over. I moved into Harold's old house in the quiet cul-de-sac, leaving my townhouse to the renters who'd been there during my months of caregiving. The property was peaceful. 3 acres backing onto the community park with a dock where Harold and I used to sit in comfortable silence watching the lake. I took a leave of absence from my freelance work and started the Elmwood Community Care Fund, using a portion of the trust to fund advocacy for fair HOA practices and support for elderly residents and their helpers. Turns out what happened to Harold and me wasn't unique. Board members using fees as personal ATMs, while the one resident who provides actual care gets labeled the problem. It's practically an epidemic in suburbs like ours. Aunt Rachel became a regular visitor, bringing casseroles and decades of neighborhood stories I'd never heard. "Harold would be so proud of you," she told me one evening as we watched the sunset from a deck. "He always said you had the real backbone." Some neighbors chose sides. Most of the older residents stood with me. Harold's extended family was divided, with his younger brother supporting me, while his sister remained loyal to Karen. I learned to be okay with the division. Neighborhood, I realized, isn't an obligation. It's a choice. I chose the people who chose me back. Derek's side hustle failed spectacularly that October. His girlfriend, the one who'd left him at the reception, posted a scathing account of their relationship on social media, including his habit of borrowing from the HOA fund. He moved to the city shortly after, supposedly for a fresh start. He still texts occasionally, usually when he needs a favor. Karen's perfect life showed cracks too. Her husband moved out in November, citing irreconcilable differences in the divorce filing. Rumors circulated about financial improprieties at his development firm. Karen had to downsize from her McMansion to a considerably smaller townhouse on the edge of the subdivision. She still posts picture-perfect HOA victory photos on Instagram, though now they're strategically cropped to hide the absence of her husband and the new no-fines policy I implemented. I'll never forget the look on Karen's face when Eli read Harold's words out loud. For the first time, she had no script, no stage, just silence. Sometimes I walk down to the dock at night, where Harold and I spent so many evenings during his final months. I talk to him, updating him on the fund's progress, or just sharing small moments from my day. I like to think he hears me, that he knows his final act of courage made a difference. I'm dating again an architect named James who designs sustainable homes along the lakeshore. He never knew the old Rebecca, the one who made herself small to keep the peace. He knows only the woman who stands her ground, who values truth over performance, who understands that real community doesn't require constant sacrifice. Last week, I received a letter from a teenage girl whose TikTok video of her memorial drama had gone viral. She wrote that watching me stand up to the board had given her courage to confront her own toxic HOA president. I used to think keeping the peace was the same as being good, she wrote. You showed me it's not. I'm still processing what happened. The decades of subtle undermining, the dramatic revelations, the public fallout. Some days I feel vindicated. Other days, I'm more in the neighborhood I wish we could have been. But mostly I feel free. Free from expectations that were never about my happiness. Free from relationships built on convenience rather than care. The power matters less than I thought it would. Yes, financial security and voting control are a profound gift. But Harold's real legacy was showing me that it's never too late to stand in your truth. Even at the very end, he found the courage to correct his mistakes. For the first community barbecue this year, I invited the people who'd stood by me. Aunt Rachel, Lillian, even Judge Kay and her husband. We gathered around the big table in Harold's old dining room, sharing stories and laughter. No performances, no hidden agendas, just genuine connection. There's a new neighborhood photo on my mantle now. It shows all of us on the deck, windblown and smiling, glasses raised to the sunset. No one stands apart. No one watches from the edges. 6 months after moving into Harold's house, I found a box in his office closet. Inside were dozens of cards and letters I'd sent him over the years. Get well notes during his first round of treatment, postcards for my business trips. He kept every one. Tucked among them was a journal, and inside his careful handwriting. Rebecca called again today. She's the only one who asks how I'm feeling without immediately telling me about her own problems. I wish I'd seen her strength sooner. I wish I'd protected her more. I sat on the floor of his office and cried for the first time since his death. Not from grief or anger, but from recognition. He had seen me after all, not just at the end, but all along. That night, I added the journal to the growing collection of real neighborhood treasures on my bookshelf. Harold's first published book, the fishing lure he and I had used to catch a record-sized bass. Aunt Rachel's handwritten recipe for apple pie. These weren't the fancy heirlooms Karen had coveted or the liquid assets Derek had counted on. They were something far more valuable. Genuine connections preserved in time. I called Eli the next morning. "I need to make new bylaws," I said when he answered. He chuckled. "Bit soon for that, aren't you?" "Maybe. But if Harold taught me anything, it's that clarity leaves less room for manipulation." We met the following week. I left specific items to people who would value their meaning, not their price tag. Harold's manuscripts to a young cousin who dreams of writing. His fishing gear to his brother who shared his love of the lake. The family photo albums to Aunt Rachel who would preserve their stories. The bulk of the trust would go to the community fund with provisions for any future projects I might have. I named Eli and Lillian as executives with Judge K as backup. No room for interpretation, no space for performance. This is the most detailed set of bylaws I've drafted for any HOA under a decade old, Eli joked as I signed the documents. "Just learning from experience," I replied. As spring turned to summer, the fund gained momentum. We partnered with 3 local hospitals to provide support services for elderly residents and their caregivers. We funded research into HOA abuse patterns and prevention. We created a legal aid program for homeowners facing board disputes similar to mine. My story became something of a cautionary tale in certain suburban circles. I received emails from HOA reform attorneys asking me to speak at their conferences. A producer from a true crime podcast called interested in featuring the Elmwood Acres drama in an episode about financial neighborhood abuse. I declined that one. Our story wasn't a crime exactly, just a sad commentary on board dynamics. Derek called in July, surprisingly sober. "I'm seeing a therapist," he said. "She says I need to make amends." "That's good, Derek." I tried to keep the skepticism from my voice. "I know you don't believe me. I wouldn't either, but I'm trying." "Rebecca, what do you want from me?" He sighed. "Nothing." "Well, not nothing. Your forgiveness eventually, but I know I haven't earned it yet." It was the first honest thing he'd said to me in years. "Keep working with your therapist," I told him. "We'll see." Karen was less introspective. She cornered me at our cousin neighbor's block party in August. Champagne sloshing dangerously close to my dress. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You think this makes you better than me?" "This isn't a competition, Karen. Everything's a competition. You took what should have been mine." A few nearby guests glanced our way. I lowered my voice. "What exactly did I take? The power you felt entitled to despite never showing up? The recognition you thought you deserved for performances no one believed? I was his neighbor too." Her voice cracked. And for a moment, I glimpsed something real beneath the perfect makeup. Genuine pain. "Yes, you were," I said more gently. "And he cared for you, but care doesn't erase consequences." She stared at me, mascara smudging slightly. "You've always been so." She struggled for the word. "Honest," I suggested. "Judgmental," she countered, but without her usual venom. I shrugged. "Maybe we're both right." She left early without the dramatic exit I'd expected. Small progress, perhaps. Fall brought changes. I returned to work part-time consulting for local firms while continuing to build the fund. James and I grew closer. He proposed at the community Christmas lights event, not with a flashy diamond, but with his grandmother's sapphire ring and a promise of partnership based on mutual respect. "I love that you don't need me," he said as we stood on the snowy dock. "But you choose me anyway." We married the following spring in a small ceremony at the community park. Aunt Rachel cried. Derek came alone and stayed sober. Karen sent a surprisingly thoughtful gift, but didn't attend. Eli danced with Lillian, confirming suspicions of a romance that had bloomed during our legal battles. As we cut the cake, I caught a glimpse of Harold's old fishing boat tied to the dock, swaying gently in the breeze. I kept it despite rarely using it myself. Sometimes symbols matter more than practicality. James followed my gaze. "We should take out tomorrow," he suggested. "I like to learn." "It's not easy," I warned him. Harold made it look effortless, but there's a knack to it. He squeezed my hand. "Then it's a good thing I have an excellent teacher." The next morning, as dawn broke over the lake, we carried coffee and Harold's old tackle box down to the dock. The water was mirror still, reflecting the pink-orange sky and the silhouettes of pine trees along the shore. "He would have liked you," I told James as we climbed into the boat. "Because I'm marrying his favorite neighbor," James teased. "Because you see people for who they are, not what they can do for you." I started the motor. "It's rarer than you'd think." We drifted to Harold's favorite fishing spot, a sheltered cove where the lake trout gathered in the cool morning hours. I showed James how to bait the hook, how to cast without tangling the line, how to wait with patience rather than expectation. As the sun climbed higher, warming our faces, I thought about power. Not the voting rights or the fund, but the values and truths passed from one generation to the next. Harold had ultimately chosen to break a dysfunctional pattern. In doing so, he'd given me permission to create something new. I got one James called his rod, bending dramatically. I talked him through reeling it and laughing as he struggled with the fighting fish. When he finally landed at a respectable 3-pound trout, his face lit up with genuine pride. "First catch is a haze," I said, snapping a photo. "Worth the wait," he replied, carefully releasing the fish back into the lake. We caught 3 more before heading back, the sun high overhead, now the day stretching before us with possibility. As we tied up at the dock, I noticed a familiar car in the driveway, Derek's rental. He was sitting on the porch steps, a paper bag beside him. He stood as we approached. "Sorry to crash your honeymoon," he said, looking genuinely uncomfortable. I found these at a storage unit I was cleaning out." He held out the bag. "Thought you might want them." Inside were photo albums, old ones with peeling covers and yellowing pages. "Harold's community albums," I said, recognizing them immediately. "I thought these were lost in the move after his wife died." "He gave them to me to digitize years ago," Derek admitted. "I never got around to it." Another broken promise. The admission hung between us heavier than the albums themselves. "Thank you for bringing them," I said finally. He nodded. "There's something else." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Harold's cufflinks. The ones his father gave him. I took them after the memorial." I shouldn't have. The box contained a pair of simple silver cufflinks engraved with a neighborhood crest. Harold had worn them to every important occasion. Board meetings, groundbreakings, milestones. "Why now?" I asked. Derek looked out at the lake. "Because I'm trying to be someone different, someone who doesn't take things that don't belong to him." James squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "I'll give you 2 sometime," before heading into the house with the fish we'd caught. Derek and I sat on the porch steps, the albums between us. "I'm not ready to forgive everything," I told him. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for that. Not yet." He gestured to the house, the lake, the life I'd built. "You deserve this, Rebecca." I didn't. It took me too long to see that. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the waves lapping against the shore. It wasn't reconciliation, not completely, but it was a beginning. As Derek left, promising to call before his next visit, I thumbed through the albums he'd returned. There was Harold's wife, young and vibrant, holding baby pictures of the neighborhood kids. There was Harold teaching toddler Derek to cast a line. And there I was, perhaps 5 years old, sitting on Harold's shoulders at the state fair. Both of us laughing at something long forgotten. We had been a neighborhood once before performance replaced presence, before appearance became more important than authenticity. The photos captured moments of genuine connection, fleeting perhaps, but real. That evening, as James and I prepared the trout for dinner, I told him about Derek's visit, about the albums and cufflinks and tentative steps towards something like forgiveness. "Do you think people can really change?" I asked as we worked side by side in the kitchen. James considered the question. "I think they can choose differently," he said finally. "Whether that's change or just revealing who they've always been underneath that's harder to say. I thought about Harold's final choice, about Derek's halting attempts at amends, about Karen's moment of genuine emotion at the block party, about my own journey from neighborhood peacekeeper to truth teller. Maybe it's both, I suggested. Maybe we're always becoming who we really are. Later after dinner, we sat on the deck, watching the stars emerge over the lake. I thought about the girl who had once stood at the edges of community photos, making herself small to keep the peace. She seemed like a stranger now, and yet she had brought me here, to this moment, to this life I'd chosen rather than inherited. What are you thinking about? James asked, his arm warm around my shoulders. That the story doesn't end, I replied, watching a shooting star trace a bright path across the night sky. It just changes. He nodded, understanding the new chapters. Then we clinked our glasses together, a quiet celebration of possibility. In the distance, a loon called across the water, its haunting cry echoing off the shore. Another answered from somewhere in the darkness. To new chapters, I agreed and meant it with my whole heart.